Okay, so deep breath, everyone. Today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff, nuclear targets.
Yeah,
But knowledge is power, right?
it is.
We're going to be looking at a YouTube video from the military show called Russia's Top Nuke Targets.
Okay.
And it's a hypothetical scenario, but it's a pretty heavy one to consider. So we're going to unpack it and see what we can learn from this analysis.
Sounds good.
Our mission for this deep dive is to understand what a large-scale nuclear attack by Russia might look like, based on this video, and what the consequences could be. This isn't about fear-mongering. This
Right.
is about being informed, right?
Absolutely.
So let's get into it. Right off the bat, the video reminds us that Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world.
Yeah, they do.
Nearly 6,000 weapons.
That's a lot of weapons.
And about 1,600 of those are actively deployed warheads. I mean, that's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. It really underscores the gravity of the situation and the potential for destruction on a massive scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So the video breaks down these potential U.S. targets into a few different categories. The first one it calls centers of power. So I'm guessing that means places like the Pentagon?
Yeah, exactly. The Pentagon, as the headquarters for the Department of Defense, would be an obvious target.
Right.
It wouldn't necessarily cripple the entire U.S. military to hit the Pentagon.
Okay.
But it would definitely severely disrupt their command and control.
Yeah.
Which would make it much harder to coordinate a response.
And of course, there's the collateral damage we have to think about.
Oh, absolutely. The video estimates that the nuclear strike on the Pentagon could result in 500,000 immediate deaths.
Wow.
In Washington, D.C. alone. Not to mention the long-term effects from radiation sickness. We're talking about potential destruction of, landmarks like the Capitol building, the White House, the Supreme Court.
It would essentially wipe out the center of American government.
Yeah.
And given how close the White House is to the Pentagon, I mean, the president would most likely be killed in an attack like that.
Most likely.
And that raises questions about, what happens next? Like, how does the government function
Right.
in that kind of chaotic situation?
Yeah, it's a chilling thing to even think about. The video does talk about the presidential line of succession.
Right.
The vice president, the speaker of the House, and so on. But can you imagine, trying to establish a functioning government?
Right.
In the middle of that level of devastation?
Yeah.
It would be a challenge.
It would be incredibly challenging. So beyond those, high-profile targets, where else might Russia aim its nuclear weapons?
Well, the video mentions U.S. missile silos.
Okay.
As another really critical category.
Yeah.
The goal there would be, from Russia's point of view, to minimize America's ability to retaliate.
Right.
So taking out the missile silos would cripple a big chunk of the U.S. nuclear arsenal.
But wouldn't it be, practically impossible to completely neutralize the U.S. nuclear force?
You're right. The U.S. has this what's called the nuclear triad. It's land-based missiles, submarines, and bombers.
Okay.
And it's designed to be, very resilient. So even with a successful first strike, it's really unlikely that Russia could wipe out the whole threat of retaliation.
Oh, okay.
But they could try to, significantly reduce the scale and effectiveness of any retaliation.
So which bases would be most vulnerable, you think?
Well, the video highlights three in particular. There's Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana.
Okay.
No Air Force Base in North Dakota. And Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. And these bases house quite a lot of Minuteman III ICBMs.
Okay.
Which are, these intercontinental ballistic missiles. Land-based missiles that can reach targets all over the globe.
Yeah, and I imagine the impact on those bases would be, absolutely devastating, not just for the military personnel who are stationed there,
right,
but also for the surrounding communities.
Oh, absolutely. The video estimates, for example, that a strike on Malmstrom could result in, almost 15,000 civilian casualties.
Oh, wow.
Just in the towns nearby.
Wow.
In addition to the, thousands of military personnel who would be killed at the base.
Yeah.
And then there's Minot. That's in a more densely populated area.
Yeah.
So the immediate death toll there could be over 23,000.
Those numbers are just horrifying. And that's not even to mention the environmental consequences, right?
Yeah, that's a whole other layer we have to consider. It wouldn't just be about the immediate deaths. There's the radioactive contamination that would be left behind.
Yeah.
The video talks about, potential contamination of the Mississippi River, groundwater, soil, the air.
It could render those areas uninhabitable.
For generations, potentially.
That's truly scary. So we've got the centers of power and the missile silos. But the video goes on to identify a third category of potential targets as well, command and control center.
Yeah. Command and control centers are like the nervous system of the U.S. military.
Okay.
They coordinate, actions, responses, everything.
Right.
So hitting these centers is all about disrupting the flow of information and orders. It's about creating chaos.
Okay, so if Russia wanted to, stop the U.S. from launching a counterattack, these command centers would be the main targets.
Exactly. The video focuses on NORAD headquarters. You know NORAD.
Yeah, they're the ones who track Santa Claus every Christmas Eve.
Yeah, exactly. But their real job is a bit more serious.
Yeah.
NORAD is a joint U.S.-Canadian operation.
Oh, okay.
And they're responsible for, detecting and responding to potential threats, like missiles, things like that.
So a nuclear strike on NORAD would have, really far-reaching consequences then, not just for the U.S.
No, for Canada as well.
For Canada too, yeah.
The video estimates that a strike on Peterson Air Force Base, where NORAD is, could result in over 60,000 deaths and 200,000 injuries.
Wow.
And then, of course, you have to factor in the long-term impact
right.
of radiation potentially spreading to neighboring states.
It's hard to even fathom that level of destruction. And then there's STRATCOM at Offa Air Force Base. What makes that such a crucial target?
STRATCOM is it's responsible for some of the most sensitive aspects of U.S. military operations. Things like nuclear deterrence, global strike planning, and then there's a global information grid.
Okay.
It's basically the network that connects and coordinates the U.S. military.
So taking out STRATCOM would be a huge blow to America's ability to respond to a nuclear attack.
Exactly. The video estimates around 40,000 deaths.
Wow.
150,000 injuries from a strike on Offa. But beyond just those immediate casualties, it's the disruption to military coordination that would be most significant. It would just create chaos, confusion.
But wouldn't there be some redundancy in the system? Couldn't they transfer command to other centers if Offa was destroyed?
Yeah, there are backup systems.
Okay.
Which is, somewhat reassuring.
Right.
But it just highlights how incredibly complex all of this is.
Right.
And how, there's this potential for just catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
In the event of something like a nuclear attack.
Okay, so we've covered the centers of power, the missile silos, command and control centers. What other targets does the video point to?
Well, this is where it gets even more unsettling.
Okay.
The video suggests that Russia might also target facilities that are critical for submarine communication.
Submarine communication, why would that be a priority?
Well, remember, submarines are a big part of that nuclear triad.
Oh, right.
Because they're hard to find.
Yeah.
And they can launch, retaliatory strikes, even if the land-based missiles and air bases are taken out.
Right. So Russia would want to cut off that communication to make it harder or less effective for a retaliation to happen?
Exactly. The video highlights 3 locations.
Okay.
The VLF transmitter in Cutler, Maine.
Okay.
The Jim Creek Naval Radio Station in Washington State.
Okay.
And the Lulu'ulai transmitter in Hawaii.
Okay.
And these facilities are basically like the communication hubs that let the U.S. stay in contact with its submarine fleet.
Okay.
Including transmitting launch codes.
And I imagine that even though those places might not be as populated as some of the other targets, the consequences would still be pretty bad.
Yeah. The video emphasizes how strategically important those communication links are. And there's the potential for a lot of environmental damage, too.
Right.
For example, if they hit Cutler in Maine, that could really hurt the coastal ecosystems there. And, potentially some of that contamination could reach major cities.
And what about Jim Creek in Washington?
Well, Jim Creek plays a similar role, but in the Pacific. And there, the video highlights the risk of widespread forest fires.
Oh, wow.
Hazardous air conditions on top of the potential radiation reaching cities like Seattle and Vancouver.
Okay. And what about Hawaii? Why would Hawaii be targeted?
Well, Hawaii acts as a backup.
Okay.
For fleet communication. So if Jim Creek was destroyed, Lulu'ulai could take over.
Okay.
And that way the U.S. can still talk to their submarines. But that redundancy is exactly what makes Hawaii itself a target.
And because Hawaii is so isolated geographically, and there are limited evacuation options, a nuclear strike there would be really devastating.
Absolutely. The video suggests that a strike on Oahu, where Lulu'ilai is located, could basically make the whole island uninhabitable.
So we've covered a lot here, from the symbolic heart of American power to these remote communication outposts. It's hard not to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction we're talking.
Yeah, it is sobering, but it's important to remember, this isn't about scaring anyone.
Right.
It's about understanding what could happen,
Mm.
the potential consequences of actions on a global scale.
And it raises some really uncomfortable questions. Like, the video suggests that Russia wouldn't just attack military targets.
Yeah,
It goes on to discuss civilian targets as well.
that's right.
So we're talking about cities full of innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that would just make things worse.
It's definitely a complicated and controversial issue,
Mm.
and the video acknowledges the ethical dilemmas involved, but it argues that in the context of a full-scale nuclear war, those considerations might not matter as much.
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
And it leads us to some of the most disturbing aspects of this whole hypothetical scenario. So when we come back, we'll dig deeper into those potential civilian targets. We'll explore what could happen if this conflict spreads globally, and we'll look at the lack of preparedness, even in countries that have these weapons of mass destruction.
Okay.
Stay with us.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. We're picking up our conversation where we left off the potential for civilian targets in a nuclear conflict.
Yeah, it's a disturbing reality we can't ignore.
Mm-hmm.
And this video we've been looking at actually gets pretty specific about which cities might be targeted.
Okay, so which cities are we talking about here?
Well, the video focuses on three main ones in the U.S., New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago. It says they would be targets not just because they're important symbolically, but also for their strategic and economic value.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. Why would those cities in particular be considered like prime targets?
Well, think about New York, for example. It's not only the financial capital of the U.S.,
Right.
it's also the most populated city in the country. It's a global symbol of American power.
Yeah.
So striking New York would be seen as a way to, inflict the most damage possible, both physically and psychologically.
And the video gets into some pretty specific details about what a nuclear attack on New York might look like.
It does. It's a pretty grim picture, to be honest. It uses Times Square as an example.
Okay.
Imagine an 800-kiloton nuclear warhead
Okay.
detonating in Midtown Manhattan.
Oh, wow.
It would create a crater 50 feet deep, right in the middle of the explosion. The shock wave, it would shatter windows for miles. Winds over 500 miles per hour, demolishing buildings, turning everyday objects into deadly projectiles.
It's hard to even picture that. And casualty estimate?
Oh, they're staggering.
Yeah.
A strike like that could kill between 1.5 and 2 million people instantly.
Wow.
Another 3 to 5 million would be seriously injured.
Yeah.
And those numbers are just from the initial blast and radiation. You have to factor in the long-term effects of the fallout, the collapse of infrastructure.
The aftermath would be almost impossible to even imagine. Can you even picture what evacuation and emergency response would be like in a city as dense as New York?
It's a logistical nightmare. I mean, the medical system would be completely overwhelmed. Transportation would be crippled. Loss of power would make communication and coordination practically impossible. The video actually quotes an article from New York Magazine, and it says, "The U.S. remains shockingly unprepared for a similar assault on its own soil. Much of the short-term response to a nuclear explosion in a city like New York would be improvised, adapted from plans meant for other kinds of disasters."
It's mind-boggling to think that a country that has these weapons could be so unprepared for what might happen if they were used.
Yeah.
But New York isn't the only city that's mentioned in the video, right? It also brings up Los Angeles.
Right. And L.A. is less densely populated than New York.
Okay.
But it covers a much bigger area geographically. And it's really reliant on cars for transportation.
Right.
So evacuation would be even more challenging.
Yeah, and with the drought problems they already have in LA, I mean, the impact on water resources would be catastrophic.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The video estimates a nuclear blast in downtown L.A. Could kill between 500,000 and 700,000 people immediately and injure another 1.5 million. Millions of people could be without safe drinking water. It would be a humanitarian crisis unlike anything we've ever seen.
It's a bleak picture. And what about Chicago? How does Chicago fit into this scenario?
Well, Chicago has a population of almost 3 million.
Right.
So it's another major area that could be targeted. The video estimates a nuclear strike there could cause 500,000 to 600,000 deaths right away, injure over 1 million more.
And because it's right on Lake Michigan, the fallout would affect the whole Great Lakes region.
Yeah, it would. Contamination of the Great Lakes would impact drinking water for millions of people.
Right.
Across multiple states, Canada too.
Yeah.
And the ecological impact, it would be huge.
So we're not just talking about isolated attacks here. It's a chain reaction, consequences that spread across the whole country. And the video makes it clear that this wouldn't just be limited to the U.S.
No.
It talks about global escalation as well.
Right. If Russia attacked the U.S. with nuclear weapons, it would almost certainly trigger a response from NATO.
Yeah.
And that would draw Europe into the conflict.
Yeah.
The video mentions Ramstein Air Base in Germany.
Okay.
It plays a key role in NATO's defense. It would likely be a target. And NATO headquarters in Belgium, other U.S. bases in Europe, they would all be vulnerable.
So basically anywhere that's important to NATO's military operations would be in danger.
Pretty much, yeah.
But would they just stick to military targets in Europe? What about civilian populations?
Well, the video highlights London as a particularly vulnerable target, both because it's the capital of the UK and because it's a global financial center.
Right.
It estimates that a nuclear attack on London could kill over 1 million people instantly, with total casualties exceeding 2.3 million. And just like with the U.S. targets, the impact wouldn't stop at London's borders.
Right.
The fallout could spread across the UK and even into Europe.
It's a terrifying thought. A nuclear conflict wouldn't be contained by borders. It would have global consequences. So what can we do? The video doesn't really offer any solutions, does it?
No, not really. Its focus is mainly on laying out the potential consequences of this kind of attack. But I think the main takeaway here is that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we understand about the scale of the potential devastation, the better equipped we are to work towards preventing it.
It's a heavy thing to carry, this knowledge of what could happen.
It is.
But you're right. We can't ignore it. We have to use this knowledge to inform our actions, to push for peace, to hold our leaders accountable for making decisions that put diplomacy ahead of aggression.
Absolutely. We have to remember that the future isn't predetermined. We have the power to choose a different path.
Yeah.
One that leads away from this threat of annihilation and towards a more peaceful and sustainable future.
That's a powerful message. And I think it's one that we all need to hear right now. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this. What can we do, individually and collectively, to create a world where the threat of nuclear war isn't constantly hanging over our heads? It's a question worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And I hope it'll spark some meaningful conversations.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us on this difficult journey. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the issues that matter. So we've been exploring this pretty heavy topic, the potential targets and consequences of a large-scale nuclear attack. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this information, you know?
Yeah.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, there's something I've been curious about. The video we've been looking at, it focuses a lot on U.S. and European targets. Yeah. Does it say anything about how other parts of the world might be affected by a conflict like this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It kind of highlights how interconnected everything is globally. The video doesn't go into specifics about, targets outside of the U.S. and Europe, but it does make it clear that a nuclear conflict wouldn't be contained.
Right.
The fallout, both literally and figuratively, wouldn't stop at any borders.
So even countries that aren't directly involved in the fighting would still suffer the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. We could be talking about disruptions to global trade, environmental damage on a massive scale, humanitarian crisis like unlike anything we've ever seen. And then there's the issue of nuclear winter.
Nuclear winter. I've heard that term, but I'm not sure I really understand what it means.
Basically, nuclear winter is this potential global cooling effect that would be caused by the huge amounts of smoke and dust that would get thrown into the atmosphere after a nuclear war. And that could disrupt weather patterns, reduce sunlight, lead to crop failures, famine.
It's a terrifying thought that even countries that are far away from where the bombs are actually dropped could face, starvation and societal collapse. Yeah,
it's a really sobering reminder that in a nuclear war there are no winners. Everyone loses.
So facing this grim reality, I mean, what can we do? Is there any hope of preventing something like this from happening?
I think there's always hope. The
Okay.
fact that we're even having this conversation, that we're
Yeah.
trying to understand these issues, it means we haven't given up. And the video itself, it focuses on the bad stuff, the consequences, but ultimately it's a call to action.
So what can we do? What actions can we take? I mean, what can I do as an individual to make a difference when the threat seems so big?
Well, I think, first of all, educate yourself. Educate others about the dangers of nuclear weapons.
Right.
Support organizations that are working to reduce nuclear proliferation. Push for policies that prioritize diplomacy and arms control. And just, talk about these issues. Have conversations with people in your community.
It's easy to feel powerless when you think about a threat this big.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
you're right, even small things can add up and help create change.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, persistence, and a belief that a better world is possible.
It's a message of hope amidst all this darkness. We can't just accept nuclear war as inevitable. We have to believe that a different future is possible and work towards it.
I completely agree. The stakes are too high to give up on hope.
Yeah.
We owe it to ourselves, to future generations, to the planet, to do everything we can to prevent this.
That's well said. This has been a difficult conversation, but incredibly important. And I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been my pleasure. And as I said, knowledge is power. And by understanding what could happen, we can make better choices and work towards a safer world.
That's a message worth repeating. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about, something to talk about, and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, the future isn't set in stone. We can choose a different path, one that leads away from annihilation and towards a brighter tomorrow. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.